continue.
Okay.
It's going to be a little bit of a repeat. But the class, today I'm here to refute Jasmine Thomas's claim that lowering the corporate income tax does not create jobs. In order to support this, her secondary claims are: one, history shows there is no assured correlation between a lower corporate income tax and an increase in job creation. Two, the money generated by corporations from a lower income tax rarely goes back to the worker and is rarely used to create jobs. And three, lowering the corporate income tax increases the deficit, thus hurting growth and job growth and worker wages. So my counter thesis to this is lowering the corporate income tax rate causes somewhat of a decrease in the unemployment rate, but has a relatively negligible effect on it. I will state each of my secondary claims as they pertain to each of Jasmine's arguments. So if we go back to her thesis, lowering the corporate income tax does not create jobs. She asserts a relatively neutral position here. The negativity of the statement diminishes its controversiality, making it less difficult to defend and more difficult to take a hard stance against. While there is potential for controversy, the argument does not take a clear, strong stance on one side or the other of the debate. So, going to her first point, history shows there is no assured correlation between a lower corporate income tax and an increase in job creation. To defend this, Jasmine uses a piece of evidence from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, showing that from 1951 to 1969, corporate income tax rate rose 42% to 50.7%, while unemployment went from 3.3 to 3.5%. However, I found information that suggests her information is inaccurate, because according to the Economic Policy Institute and procon.org, the corporate income tax rate actually stayed around 50 to 52% throughout this time period, and I was unable to find corporate income tax rate statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Also, as reported by procon.org, between those times the unemployment rate fluctuated as low as 2.5% and as high as 7.4%, showing no obvious correlation between the corporate tax rate at the time and the unemployment rate. If we also look at unemployment rates reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the 2010s, the U.S. had just come out of a recession at an all-time high rate of 9.9% unemployment in December 2009. It decreased to 3.7% by November 2018 steadily. However, the corporate tax rate remained unchanged around 35% from 1994 to 2017. History shows there's no assured correlation between increased corporate income taxes and increased unemployment rates, and no correlation between a lower corporate tax and a decrease in job creation. So, her second point, the money generated by corporations from a lower income tax barely goes back to the worker and is rarely used to create jobs. To defend this, she uses two examples, one about a 2004 tax repatriation holiday and a study of 92 companies' employment numbers versus CEO pay rate before and after the Trump Tax Act, which decreased the corporate income tax from 35% to 21% in 2018. The findings of these examples cannot be ignored, that these companies in question tended to redirect extra income to stock buyback, shareholders, and or CEOs' paychecks rather, while laying off employees and or cutting their wages, which we can all agree seems fairly unethical. However, this brings me to my second supporting point, that not all corporations behave unethically when given tax cuts. The data of these two examples focuses on the largest companies in the U.S. income-wise, and in order to become so large, many of these companies were likely less than ethical in business practices and that sort of thing. But just because these companies, that does not mean that all companies benefiting from corporate tax cuts will behave the same way. This brings me to my third point. Corporate tax cuts have historically been used to help alleviate unemployment in times of recession. President John F. Kennedy cut taxes and expanded Social Security and employment benefits to counter a brief recession at the beginning of his term. The rate went from 6.7% in 1961 to 5.5% in 1962. This information is from alkrulik.org. The Tax Foundation Taxes and Growth Model also estimates that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will increase long-run GDP by 1.7%, create 339,000 jobs, and raise wages by 1.5% on average. However, the act is designed to work over a long time period, so these results are not expected to be seen anytime soon. This brings me to my third point, or Jasmine's third point. Lowering the corporate income tax rate increases the deficit, thus hurting job growth and worker wages. This is not disputable that this would reduce federal revenue, but this assumes that the government's revenue lost from a tax cut is more hurtful to the country than the boost to the economy gained by the money saved by corporations, which is, in turn, is injected back into the workforce. It is also only applicable to those with public sector jobs, those employed by the government, which according to Forbes, only 15.3% of jobs in the US are in the public sector as of 2015. So, in summary, Jasmine claims that lowering the corporate income tax does not create jobs. However, this is not as serious of an issue as it is made out to be. She attempts to draw a line between two statistics that have some correlation between them, but no solidification for causation. And this is because there are many factors that affect unemployment. Most importantly among those are job availability in specific industries, workforce ability, technological advancements, which make some jobs less important or obsolete, and consumer demand for goods and services. In my thesis, this is what I mean by corporate tax rates having a relatively negligible effect on the unemployment rate. Finally, it is not an actionable claim because it doesn't establish an affirmative cause and effect between the two events. Thank you for your time.
Okay, you summarize the advocate's claim pretty clearly. You offer a counterclaim, but it's not a very strong response. In fact, you're not taking an opposite position. And at best, you're kind of diminishing the importance of the advocate's position and suggesting that there might be a negligible effect of the tax cuts, which is okay. I mean, it is a response. It just doesn't seem like you're going to be pressing it very hard on that issue. On the first point, you've got a specific reference to the advocate's evidence. You challenge the income tax rates that she's presented by suggesting that there is inconsistent information on what those rates were. And you also mentioned that the unemployment rate went up and down substantially in that time period. If it stayed relatively stable on the tax rate and the unemployment rate went up and down substantially, I think that tends to support the position that the advocate's suggesting that it doesn't really have a big impact on creating jobs. You show that it doesn't, that it seems like it's largely unrelated to those kinds of things. I think the way you want to interpret this is, say, by pointing out that we didn't have a decrease in the tax rate, so we didn't have any increased variation in the normal job creation rates in that time period, and maybe that would support your position. I'm not sure that the way you presented it actually does much to help your position. It suggests more that there is, an absence of a relationship. Maybe, and I understand if you don't want to be pressed into the position of taking the opposite position. You don't have to do that, but it does makes it a little bit more difficult to figure out how your position really responds to the advocate's position. On the second point, you mostly concede the two examples that she has, and you kind of make this presupposition that the two examples might be unique and atypical because they're big companies and they're a bunch of unethical bastards to begin with. I'm not sure that that's a good way to undermine the example there. And if you, without any other evidence to show how widespread employee activity was, whether or not they got money back from corporate tax decreases, I'm not sure. One of the other things that I think is missing here is the notion that corporate tax rates have an effect on the taxes that corporations actually pay, since there are all kinds of loopholes built in and ways in which people manage to manipulate their money. There may in fact be almost no variation in how much we bring in as a result of changes either increasing or decreasing the corporate tax rate. I've heard that as a criticism on this particular point. On the tax cuts that we recently had, suggesting that there may in fact be a benefit, you suggest that there is going to be a benefit, a slight benefit, but it is something that we'll only be able to measure over time. So it's hard to look at the moment and suggest that there is some contradictory conclusion that you've got here. I think you've got, like I said, some reasonable arguments about whether or not a substantial link exists. But that was kind of the advocate's position, too. Both of you seem to be taking the position we don't know very much about this. All right, thank you.